Welcome back to another episode of Legitimate Matters. This is William Paris and I am your host. Today we have a very interesting topic about diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Even though U.S. companies spend upwards of $8 billion, if you can imagine that, per year on diversity and inclusion training, studies show that these initiatives have failed to yield significant changes within particular organizations, especially when it comes to inclusion. Once an organization succeeds in hiring women, people of color, or people who are LGBTQ, they need to figure out how to promote and foster inclusivity so that these employees are successful. According to Harvard Business Review, without inclusion, the crucial connections that attract diverse talent, encourage their participation, foster innovation, and lead to business growth, it just won't happen. And my guest today is Helen Higginbotham. And Helen is an attorney who specializes in diversity. That's her background. And she has spent years working with diversity and inclusion. And I'm going to let her tell you more about it. Helen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, William.
Let's start by just bringing our audience in so that they understand your background and your experience as an attorney and why this topic is so important to you.
Okay. So my background is very interesting, if I say so myself. I am an attorney. I specialize in, my training specialized in labor and employment law. But prior to that, I had an MBA, and I worked for many years in management. And most times I was working in a union shop. So when you work in a union shop, you're dealing with a lot of employee issues. So that came before law school. So just dealing with those issues and fairness and equality and equal representation, all that stuff came into play. And when I went to law school and then I worked in labor relations, my most recent position was as a director of affirmative action at a college and dealing with diversity and inclusion and, equality in the workplace, and discrimination. So it's huge to me.
Well, this is really what I would consider to be a hot topic.
It is.
It's something that we should certainly be paying attention to. But I guess we can start with the question of diversity and affirmative action. And I would like you to give us an explanation of the difference between the two.
So essentially, we all know that affirmative action came about in the 60s. It was introduced originally by President Kennedy as an executive order. And basically what he said is that any people in any companies engaged in federal contracting of any kind or employment in the area, those employers were ordered by the government to take affirmative action to ensure equality in the workplace for employees and contractors in terms of race, creed, color, and national origin.
Okay.
Fast forward, LBJ, became president, and then he amplified it and included sex and introduced it as law as a part of the Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Okay.
So all this is happening in the 60s, and we know that in the 60s, the issue was civil rights, and the main focus was to try and address the ills of the past and to equal the playing field for specifically blacks, but women as well in the workplace. So that's what affirmative action was about. And Title VII said that discrimination was specifically prohibited in the workplace. So fast forward, that became an issue of inequality from people from the majority class because they're feeling that they're being neglected. So along came concepts of, quota. People were feeling they were excluded via
Right.
quotas. You had the issue of reverse discrimination, which
Right.
that was a new thing too. So all of this, and there were some cases that went to court that dealt with that issue. And so to deal with that and to kind of remove, and I think diversity came into play to remove us away from the issue of race. So diversity and inclusion in the workplace, very important. I'm committed to it 100%. But how do we implement it? Are we committed to it? What does it mean? By definition, diversity means variety. But in the workplace, variety of what? Variety of who? Race pretty is like the last issue that we deal with, I think, in terms of diversity, because now diversity means diversity of gender, which is important,
Right.
disability, LGBTQ,
Right.
those people who are marginalized. But what we don't talk about when dealing with all that, we'll talk about people of color,
Right.
and that's still dancing around the issue of race, because people of color what does that mean, especially in terms of employment? Are we trying to recruit Black Americans? Are we trying to recruit Asian Americans? Whose issues are we dealing with in the workplace? So I think those are the difference between the two, and how. But still, affirmative action is on the books. So it's interesting.
Well, I'm listening to you, and what I'm hearing is that these issues of diversity, even though it's been talked about, and even though the affirmative action was put into place and has been more emphasized since the 60s, here we are in 2019. As a matter of fact, in 2017, the current administration, in terms of universities, actually attempted to shut it down,
Right.
and to actually reverse affirmative action.
Right.
So we have an administration that's pushing back.
Well, he wants to erase all of civil rights gains.
Well, he wants to erase all civil
Yeah.
rights gains,
Right,
and we are, and it's clear and obvious. But for the companies that have not caught on, why is this even important to them to even pay attention to this?
Wow, it's crucial because one, America is a melting pot.
Right.
And it's crucial because in terms, we're a global society.
Right.
So we don't just do business with quote unquote Americans. We have all kinds of people in our country, and we're doing business with countries abroad. So it's important for us to be inclusive so when I think of things that have happened recently in the press that could have been avoided if you had if you had a mixture of people around the table when you made the decisions. And for instance, this last week we had a situation with Katy Perry,
Right.
and the shoes that she put out that had images of Black Sambo. Prior to that, this week also you had Gucci with
Right.
the Black Sambo sweater. We had Prada, another company. These are major companies, but Prada used the luggage tags that
Right.
had the Black Sambo look on it. And they had this in a display in a window in New York City, of all places. So you look at these things that are happening and you say, if you have diversity around the marketing table, the employees, or your merchandising table, who's making the decision? Because if you have a Black person at that table, they're going to let you know that this is offensive to them,
Hopefully.
Well, yeah, we would hope. We would hope that and that's where inclusion comes
Right.
in. What kind of environment have
Right.
you created in the workplace that tells employees that it's okay, that, we want you to speak up because, this hits your bottom line. That's the other problem
Okay.
for these companies, because it results in lawsuits.
Exactly.
And if you have people around the table who are telling you like this doesn't feel right, then
You need to pay attention.
You'll bystep that.
Okay. Well, this is really quite a topic that can become really intense because it's so relevant today. But we're going to go to break, and we're going to continue this conversation about diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And I don't know if this is something that you're aware of, if this is something that you're feeling yourself, but it is something that happens across America. So come back after the break. This is William Paris. This is Legitimate Matters. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
It's no secret that there's a lot to be done in the diversity and inclusion space. At eBay, we're focusing our efforts in 3 strategic areas. First, our workforce, or how we hire and who we hire. Second, our workplace. We love hiring great talent, and we want to make sure we keep that great talent. So making sure that we're being inclusive for all people at eBay. And then finally, our marketplace. This is how we were founded, on the premise that people are good. And so the millions of buyers and sellers that come from vastly different backgrounds, religions, cultures, and languages, we have to be deliberate about making sure that we reach them in a way that meets them where they are. We're excited about the programs and initiatives that are driving our diversity and inclusion efforts. However, equally as important are the conversations and the learnings that will come from each other. And so at eBay, we're pushing our culture to become comfortable with the uncomfortable yet extremely valuable conversations that we need to have as human beings to grow, to learn, and to understand the differences that make eBay unique.
Hi, I'm William Paris. I am so excited about my new talk show, Legitimate Matters. My topics are inspiring, informative, and sometimes controversial. For show topics, upcoming guests, and hot topics, follow me on facebook.com/Legitimate Matters or on my YouTube channel, Legitimate Matters. Now, this show is for you because you're legitimate and you matter. Legitimate Matters. Welcome back to Legitimate Matters. Once again, I am your host, and I'm here having a great conversation with my guest, Helen Higginbotham, and we're talking about diversity and inclusion in the workplace. And Helen, a lot of employers or corporations make public declarations about diversity and inclusion in the workplace, but is that real? Is it concrete? What are your thoughts on that?
So basically what happens is employers are mandated to make public declarations about diversity and inclusion. You cannot pick up a employment application that doesn't say that women and minorities are encouraged to apply. So the question for me is, we make public declarations, but where's our commitment? So when you look at the rosters, when you look at the composition of the company, it doesn't live up to what they're saying that that they want to do publicly. So we have a situation where, the government still requires that if you are an employer and you receive, if you have 50 or more employees and you receive more than $50,000 in government contract, which is not hard to do, there are some things that you have to do. So the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Program says that to get these monies, to qualify for these monies, there are 4 things that you have to have in place. And one is you have to have an anti-discrimination policy that is in place and enforced. You have to have an affirmative action plan that you're looking at what the trends that are happening in your company in terms of race and equality of salary and things of that nature. You have to have programs that are in place that promote women and minorities in the workplace. And you have to have an officer in place who is ensuring that these things are happening.
Does this only apply to government agencies that are being funded by the government, or is there, or does this apply to the private sector, your private corporations?
So in terms of that contract, and most private companies get government contracts.
Okay,
everybody's contract with them. So, and then for those who don't, there's some goodwill, some social responsibility that says these are things that we're going to do. So are they doing them? And, and I think in many cases that we're not. We give a lot of lip service to it. We treat diversity like it's a soundbite, and it's check the box. So when we were talking in the last segment about these companies that find themselves in these positions where they've done this advertisement that comes back to bite them in a public way, well, then we do some quick remedy stuff. We hire a black CDO as chief diversity officer. We, say that we're going to give the whole company training in terms of racial subconscious, unconscious racial bias and cultural sensitivity. So we do these kinds of things, and we, for public display, so that we can get the heat off of us. And we'll pay a lawsuit, and people will sign off so that they don't talk about what happened to them, but the problem still exists. So until you deal with the fundamental problem in the corporation and from the top down, because if it's not driven from the top down, there's no commitment to it.
Well, one thing that I've noticed, if you take a look, if you go to the internet and you look at different corporations, just randomly search and do the About Us, click on About Us, or click on, who we are. And it's very, very telling, because the people on certain levels are all the same, okay, usually white, okay, and in key positions. And I don't believe for one moment that these organizations that are hiring are not able to find diversity in leadership on the C level. But that's not what you see. And if anyone ever wanted to prove me wrong, search the internet for yourself, because I do it.
But these are the same companies who are telling you how committed they are to diversity. They're doing PSAs. I know of a situation where, a personal experience when I worked for a company here in New York, and in 35 years, this company had never hired any non-white managers in New York City.
Wow.
So are we to believe that you never? And when they did, it was because you had a responsible CEO who said that hey managers, your bonuses are going to be tied to diversity. So then they did. They hired Puerto Ricans and Black and Iranian. They had a rainbow.
Okay.
So why do we have to be pushed to that to make it happen? And I could tell you other examples, but we can't, we have to hold people accountable who are at the table, who are making these decisions. And if they put somebody who looks like me or you at the table, then what is our level of responsibility when we get there? And that's important.
Right.
Because why are we there? You're there, if we believe in diversity and inclusion, you want my voice to be included, not just my face. And even though we dance around the issue of race in terms of diversity, the example that you give is wonderful, because when you go to the website, you're looking at the visual. You're not looking at, somebody's disability. We hire on diversity of thought, which I'm not sure how we do that, because how do you look at my resume and know my diversity of thought? But these are the kinds of things that we use when we talk about diversity, rather than dealing with the issue of race.
Well, we're going to take another break, and I'm enjoying this conversation. I could talk to you for hours about this, because I live this. I'm an African-American man, and I live this, and I have lived it for many, many years. But we're going to take a break, and stay with us. Once again, William Paris, Legitimate Matters. We'll be right back.
What do you wish for? A nice life? Nice things? Or do you wish for something more, a sense of purpose? Do you wish to discover a cure, to write code that cracks an unsolvable question, to further our exploration into space, or to invent something that changes everything right here on Earth? Well, if that's your wish, make yourself ready, because when you look back, you'll see that you didn't just make wishes, you realized them.
So there you are, shuffling through a stack of resumes, and you come to mine. This is it, first impression, my way in. But can my resume show you how I truly stand out? Like that I was studying, going to night school while working 2 jobs just to help my parents pay for groceries. Or being the first one to always step up. No, that's something you just can't put on paper. Look beyond the resume and discover new ways to develop great talent that is dedicated, hardworking, and determined like me.
What's so important about equality and diversity in the workforce? Inclusion inspires. The best companies know that an inclusive environment inspires creativity and innovation. Different kinds of people from different kinds of places with diverse backgrounds all working together. Who we are, where we come from, and what we've experienced influence the way we perceive issues and solve problems. In a work environment that honors individuality, human dignity and equality, people want to be themselves and are empowered to do the best work of their lives.
Welcome back to Legitimate Matters. Once again, your host, William Paris, here with my guest, Helen Higginbotham, and we're talking about diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Helen, in the last couple of segments, we were talking about some of the challenges and disparities within the workplace as it relates to diversity and inclusion. One thing that you touched on was the responsibility of those that are in particular positions making or speaking up. And I don't know if that's happening, or what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's a challenge, but I think that, if you come from a marginalized or disenfranchised group, what is your level of responsibility? Why are you sitting at that table? Who do you represent at that table? And I think that as a community, let's just talk about Black folks, we need to challenge people who are at that, who are at the table. We get excited. We have an NAAC picnic. We're all happy. We invite them.
Right.
But are we asking them, what are you doing for our community? So, and it goes beyond that. So if, in fact, I am a woman and I work in HR, and I know that they're paying women 50 cents and men $1, at what point is it my responsibility to speak on that? If I'm an affirmative action officer and I know that you just did a massive recruitment for a job, and you brought back all white candidates or all Black candidates, that's not diversity, however you look at it. So when is it my responsibility to speak to that? And as a community, like I said, hold each other accountable. And in the country, we're ready to talk about, pay disparities in terms of gender. We're not ready to talk about pay disparity in terms of race. So if I am the HR person or this chief diversity officer or the affirmative action officer, and I see this happening, what is my responsibility? And at what point are we complicit in our own oppression?
Right. So is there a concern now, if there is a particular individual that's sitting at that seat or sitting at the table, and this is a person who's responsible for diversity, but they're also an employee. So now they're an employee who we would think needs to speak up because that is their responsibility, especially if they're an officer of diversity within the organization. But then if, as you mentioned in a previous segment, coming from the top, but if it's not coming from the top, that person who sits in that seat knows the culture of the company and would be less likely to speak up because they know it would threaten their job.
Absolutely.
So the accountability, I would imagine, needs to come from even above that. There needs to be checks and balances that are even higher than that. And that's not what I see. I see companies doing their own thing.
Absolutely. And, and the sad thing is that they hire people who look like me and you to be the cover so that, they can parade us out and say, we don't discriminate. We have Helen. We have William. And I understand that we have families to feed and bills to pay. But you know what I say? Where would we be if our ancestors who were involved in the civil rights struggle had waited for it to be a comfortable situation? At some point, you got to step up and speak out. And if you speak out, there's a way that you speak out, which is what I want to teach companies to do. I want to teach employees to do. Teach the companies that, why this is important for them to commit to, and also teach employees how you're empowered in the workplace. And if you do things in the right way and you pose a question in the right way, people will hear you. And it's not easy to do, but I think at some point We have to challenge ourselves, or we can't keep complaining.
Helen, I really appreciate that. And really what jumps out at me as I'm listening to you is education. And I'm going to be honest and say that I could see someone being afraid to speak up because they're afraid to lose their job. But you just said that there's a way to do it. And you want to teach workshops on how to speak up, and that's something that you and I should certainly talk about later. But I think that education and understanding that you can be empowered without feeling threatened. And that, I think, is extremely important. So now, how can companies create a culture where employees do feel appreciated and included and involved?
Yeah. Again, it's top down. It has to come from the top, and don't just talk about it, be about it, demonstrate it. Hold people accountable. If you have upper management who's not being inclusive or not hiring people who look different or what, then hold them accountable. And your recruit in various areas. If you're getting the same pool of people all the time, then you're probably recruiting from the same pool. Engage your workforce and ask them, if there's a job that's being advertised, ask them to share it with their circles and get different kinds of applicants, and create employment committees, search committees where your employees are involved on it, and not just in terms of diversity, in terms of race and gender, but because it's a company and you want everybody to feel involved, bring in people from all of the departments to be part of these committees. There are just things that you can do that make your employees feel valued, because employees who are happy are employees who are productive, and employees who are productive bring revenue for everybody. So, all employers should want to work on the workplace. So diversity is key, but inclusion is key. And inclusion includes everybody, black, white, whatever. When people come to work, they should feel valued. And that's what's important for employers to make that happen.
Well, I want to have the conversation about that workshop.
I want to do a workshop.
And the one thing that I will say to that is that when that workshop is put in place, I think it's the people on that C level that actually need to be in those workshops to understand the benefits for the organization.
Right.
Because if the people at the top are not part of the training, and you delegate that responsibility to mid-level managers to roll out the philosophy or the culture for the company, then it's never going to work, and you're going to have continual breakdowns. Helen, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
I really appreciated this. I could talk to you, and I have spoken to you for hours. So it's always a pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And for my viewers, continue to watch Legitimate Matters. Our topics are just getting hotter and hotter, but they're relevant. This is what's happening today, and what Legitimate Matters is talking about, mainstream media is not. Legitimate Matters, remember to go to YouTube, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and as always, I greatly appreciate you watching. I'm William Paris, and this is Legitimate Matters.